If you think you can steal a throne from the woman who built it, watch what happens when she's been watching you the whole time. Drop a like and comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Follow until the very end. Because the moment Dante Moretti made his first move against Valentina Romano, the game was already over. He just didn't know it yet. Every choice he made, every lie he told, every promise he whispered, she heard it all. Now it's time to see what happens when the most dangerous woman in organized crime decides to collect. Avik. The estate sat on the edge of a cliff above the Pacific like something carved out of ambition and threat. 42 rooms, 12-foot ceilings, walls hung with paintings that cost more than most men made in a decade. The kind of place that wasn't bought. It was won, incrementally, through a particular combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and the patience to wait until the right moment to strike. Dante Moretti had lived in that house for 10 years and never once understood what it really was. He stood on the West Terrace now, one hand wrapped around a crystal flute of Krug 1988, the other resting on the stone railing as the ocean wind moved through his dark hair. He was 41, lean in the way of a man who still ran 5 miles every morning because vanity and discipline had merged into something indistinguishable. His jaw was sharp. His eyes were the color of old amber, warm on the surface and completely cold underneath when he forgot to manage them. Tonight he wasn't managing them at all. Tonight he let everything he felt run across his face, the satisfaction, the hunger, the relief, because there was nobody here to watch. Nobody who mattered, anyway. "Come out here," he said. Celeste Vaughn appeared in the terrace doorway barefoot, wearing a silk robe that belonged to someone else. She was 28, tall, with the kind of beauty that didn't ask for permission in any room it entered. Her dark hair was still slightly damp from the shower. She held her own glass loosely, the way someone holds a thing when they're not thinking about it. She looked at the water. The cliffs dropped nearly 200 feet straight down to where the surf broke white and churning against the rocks. She had never been comfortable with that view. "It's a long way down," she said. "Don't look down," Dante told her. "Look out." She moved to stand beside him, close enough that he could smell the shampoo on her. Something cedar and clean, the wrong scent for this house entirely. He didn't notice. Or he noticed and had decided not to think about it. "She's in Geneva," he said. "Flight landed 6 hours ago. She'll be in meetings for 4 days minimum, and knowing Valentina, probably 6. He swirled the champagne. "She never does anything in less time than she thinks it deserves." "You've been saying that for 3 months, Celeste said. Her voice was even. She was good at even. "I've been careful for 3 months." "There's a difference between careful and ready." He turned to look at her. "You think I'm not ready." She looked back at him. She had very dark eyes, steady and direct, and there were moments when they stripped something away from the people she looked at. This was one of those moments. "I think ready is a word men use when they want permission." Dante laughed. It was a short, hard sound, more breath than humor. He turned back to the water. "She's built this thing for 20 years, he said. "Casinos, shipping, real estate, the offshore accounts, the whole network. All of it sitting inside corporations nobody can trace back to anything real. 14 months ago, I started looking, quietly, asking the right people the right questions." He took a long swallow of champagne. "You know what I found?" "What?" "That she's the only signature on any of it." He set the flute down on the railing. "Every holding company, every LLC, every offshore structure in the Caymans and Luxembourg and Cyprus, all of it flows back to entities that only Valentina controls." His jaw tightened briefly. "Like I don't exist." "Do you? On paper?" "No," he said. "That's the point. She built the whole empire without leaving my name on a single line. Not $1, not one asset." The muscle beneath his left eye moved. "I've been the face. I've been the handshake and the dinner table and the man who stands beside her at functions and convinces people the Romano organization has a human side for 10 years, and not one document acknowledges it." Celeste was quiet for a moment. The wind came up hard off the Pacific and moved the robe around her legs. "So you started talking to Volkov." Dante picked his glass back up, said nothing. "Dante, it's handled." "That's not an answer." He turned to face her fully. There was something in his expression that could have been affection or could have been the careful arrangement of affection, and in the lamplight coming through the terrace doors, it was genuinely difficult to know which. In 6 weeks, Valentina Romano will not be in a position to run anything. When that happens, every asset she controls reverts to the family structure. And I am the family. I've been the family for 10 years. Every capo in this organization knows my face. He moved a strand of damp hair away from her cheek with 2 fingers. They'll fall in line. And Volkov? Volkov gets what I promised him. 3 safe houses in the Northeast, 2 money transfer channels. The logistics contact in Rotterdam. He paused. After that, the Volkov syndicate has no leverage. We renegotiate from a position of strength. Celeste searched his face. He believed it. That was the disturbing part. He had constructed this architecture of intention so completely that he actually believed it, the way a man believes his own alibi when he's told it enough times. She had seen this in him for 14 months, the slow crystallization of want into certainty, desire into plan. She told herself it wasn't her business. She told herself a lot of things. "All right," she said. "All right," he repeated, pleased. He touched his glass to hers. "To what comes next?" They drank. The security camera mounted at the northeast corner of the terrace had a rotation interval of 11 seconds. It had been recording continuously for 18 months. There was a second camera inside the terrace awning that Dante did not know existed. Both were feeding live to a secure server beneath the estate's wine cellar that Dante also did not know existed. Valentina Romano watched the terrace footage on a 14-inch screen inside a climate-controlled room 3 levels below the house she was supposedly 7,000 miles away from. She had arrived back from the airport 4 hours ago. She had not been to Geneva. She set down her own glass, water, no ice, a slice of lemon, and looked at the frozen image of her husband touching his champagne flute to Celeste Vaughn's. The timestamp in the corner read 11:47 p.m. The terrace camera had excellent resolution. She could read the name on the champagne bottle they'd left on the outdoor table. It was the 1988 Krug. She'd been saving that case for something specific. She picked up a slim leather notebook and made a note. Then she turned off the screen and went back to work. Valentina Romano had been building the structure that would become the Romano organization since she was 26 years old, in a small office above a dry cleaning business in a part of the city that no longer existed the way it had then. The man who had given her the first piece of it, her uncle, Marco Ferrante, had done so reluctantly and with conditions, the primary one being that she would dissolve everything if she married. The secondary condition was that she would defer to his judgment on all major decisions. She had agreed to both conditions with the directness that he had interpreted as compliance. She was very good at that. Marco Ferrante had died 8 years ago of complications following surgery. By that point, every LLC, every holding company, every real estate entity, every offshore account had already been restructured around her sole ownership. She had accomplished this quietly, over 4 years, while appearing to consult him on all major decisions. She was also very good at that. The people who worked inside the Romano organization, the capos, the soldiers, the accountants, and cyber specialists and logistics coordinators, understood who ran things. It was not a secret. It was also not a thing that was discussed openly, because Valentina had constructed a public-facing layer of the organization that looked different from the functional reality, and maintaining that distinction was one of the organization's most important operational disciplines. Dante's role in that public layer had been genuine and valuable. She had recognized, when she married him, that he had real gifts. He was comfortable in rooms she found tedious. He understood social architecture in ways that were useful, and he moved through the surface world of the organization with a natural authority that she had sometimes found it convenient to use as a proxy. He was also, and she had known this from the beginning, a man whose relationship to what he deserved was almost entirely untethered from what he had actually built. She had married him anyway. She had done so with clear eyes and a specific calculation, which was that his usefulness at the surface layer was worth the management cost of his ego, and that as long as she kept the structural architecture of the organization invisible to him, the arrangement would remain sustainable. She had been correct about most of this. She had been wrong about his ambition. Not wrong about its existence. She had always known it was there. A low hum beneath everything he did, the way a man holds a fork when he thinks he should be at a better table. She had been wrong about its trajectory. She had assumed it would remain diffuse, something he managed through small victories and the performance of importance. She had not anticipated that it would find a direction. He had found that direction 14 months ago. She knew this because her security team had flagged an unusual pattern of contact requests from people in his network, people who had no legitimate reason to be communicating directly with the organization's operational layer. She'd had her intelligence chief, a woman named Reyes, who had been with the organization for 11 years, begin a discreet assessment. What Reyes had assembled over the following 14 months was not a surveillance operation. It was a portrait. Dante met Celeste Vaughn at a gallery opening in Manhattan 11 months ago. He had been attending the opening as a representative of one of the organization's real estate subsidiaries, which was a legitimate event appearance. The woman was a commercial photographer with a clean background, no criminal exposure, and no connection to anything relevant. Their introduction had been organic and unplanned. What was neither organic nor unplanned was the subsequent pattern of meetings. 17 over 9 months, in 6 different cities, at hotels and private apartments, and once, in a moment of staggering carelessness, in a restaurant 2 miles from the estate. The operational security was poor. Dante had clearly never expected anyone was looking. That had always been his most fundamental mistake. He had been inside the Romano organization long enough to understand its intelligence capacity in the abstract, but not long enough to genuinely internalize what it meant to be watched by people who were very good at watching. Reyes had found the Volkov connection in month 4 of the assessment. Igor Volkov ran a criminal syndicate out of the Northeast with interests in narcotics, gambling, and labor racketeering. The Volkov syndicate was not a small operation, but it operated at a different structural level than the Romano organization. More direct, more violent, more visible, with the particular instability that came from leadership that had never learned to distinguish between power and force. Valentina had been aware of Volkov for years and had maintained a deliberate distance, not because he was too dangerous, but because the cost-benefit calculation had never resolved in favor of engagement. What Reyes had found were traces, indirect, careful, but there once you knew where to look, of Dante using intermediaries to communicate with Volkov's operational people. The early contacts were preliminary and deniable. By month 7, they had moved past preliminary. The offer Dante had extended, 3 Northeast safe houses, 2 established money transfer channels, the logistics contact in Rotterdam, represented a meaningful piece of the Romano organization's operational infrastructure. Dante knew about these assets because his public-facing role had given him partial visibility into the surface layer of the organization's operations. He had been wrong in several specific and important ways about how those assets were actually structured, which meant what he was promising Volkov he could deliver was not precisely what he believed it to be. Valentina had made a decision not to correct this misunderstanding. Volkov's people thought they were negotiating for a piece of a machine. What they were actually moving toward was a trap with no mechanism for exit, built so gradually and precisely that by the time it closed, there would be no argument to make. She had spent 3 months ensuring the documentation was complete. The morning after Dante and Celeste's terrace conversation, Valentina left the estate before dawn and drove 40 minutes north on the coast highway to a warehouse her organization used for document storage. She parked in the lot, walked through 2 security checkpoints, and went to a back office where a man named Kessler was waiting with 4 accordion files on a conference table. Kessler was her family lawyer, not in the theatrical sense, but in the practical one. He was 63, entirely bald, and possessed of a stillness that came from spending 30 years as the only person in a room who understood the exact legal implications of everything being said in it. He had no wife. He had no hobbies. He had a single malt scotch he drank in measured amounts at 9 p.m. each evening and a complete lack of interest in the social dimensions of the work. He was the best lawyer Valentina had ever encountered. "Walk me through the ownership chain one more time," she said, sitting down and opening the first file. Kessler walked her through it. He had a particular way of presenting information, flat, precise, without editorial commentary, that she had always found more valuable than any amount of analysis. The ownership chain was clean. The corporate structure was clean. Everything that was supposed to be documented was documented. The offshore structures in Luxembourg, Cyprus, and the Caymans had all been reviewed by local counsel in each jurisdiction in the past 60 days. There were no vulnerabilities. The presentation format, she said, for a large display. Kessler nodded. He slid a separate folder across the table. I had it reformatted for a 12-foot projection at 4K resolution. The key documents are legible from 30 feet. She opened the folder and looked at the first page. The ownership chain for the estate itself, the house on the cliff, the property on which it sat, the ancillary structures, the private road, ran through a Delaware holding company into a Nevada LLC into a Cayman Islands entity, all ultimately controlled by a single instrument, a private trust with Valentina Romano as sole trustee and beneficiary. The trust had been established 16 years ago. There was not a single line on any document where Dante Moretti's name appeared. She read through it carefully. Then she set it down. What about the timing? She said. After the projection. Kessler looked at her. Once the documents are displayed in a witnessed context, any subsequent claim he might attempt to make, to assets, to organization interest, to any form of ownership, is essentially foreclosed. He would need to demonstrate that an agreement existed, that consideration was exchanged, that there was an expectation of interest. None of those elements are present. He has no documentation. He has no legal standing. He paused. He has nothing. Valentina looked at the second file. Inside it were financial records, wire transfers, cash movements, expenditure patterns, showing Dante's private financial activity over the past 14 months. An account in his name in the Caymans that she had never been told about. Transfers to Celeste Vaughn's LLC totaling approximately $400,000. Payments to 2 private investigators who had been looking into the Romano organization's asset structure. Investigators who had, in both cases, been quietly fed incorrect information by Reyes's network. The aggregate picture of a man who believed he was gathering intelligence and was, in fact, walking in circles someone else had drawn. The third file was the Volkov documentation. She read through it the way she had read through it 6 times before, methodically, without hurry, looking for gaps. Reyes had used 4 independent sources to document the contacts between Dante's intermediaries and Volkov's operational people. The most recent contact had been 11 days ago. In it, Dante's intermediary had confirmed a preliminary timeline. Valentina would be eliminated within the next 2 months after her return from the Geneva meetings, and following confirmation, Volkov's people would move to consolidate the Northeast safe houses within a week. Valentina finished reading. She closed the file. 2 months, Kessler observed. He's not patient, Valentina said. He never has been. She looked out the small window of the back office at the lot outside, pale gray in the pre-dawn light, a delivery truck sitting at the loading dock. She had a particular way of appearing completely still, a quality that people who didn't know her sometimes mistook for serenity. It was the opposite. It was the absolute economy of motion of someone who spent a great deal of energy on precision and had no surplus to waste on fidgeting. Get Reyes, she said, and get me Torres. Torres was her head of security, former military intelligence, built like a door, precise in the specific way that men who had operated in genuinely dangerous environments became precise. He had been with the organization for 7 years and had never, in those 7 years, displayed emotion that was not operationally relevant. She respected this about him. He arrived 20 minutes after Kessler made the call, sat down across from Valentina, and listened without interrupting while she gave him the framework for what was going to happen. The timing is the week of the 14th, she said. I want the estate's internal security upgraded before then. Secondary checkpoints on all access roads. I want the surveillance system running at full capacity, all feeds recording to the secure archive. She paused. I also want a secondary team outside, 4 people, minimum, with eyes on the main gate and the cliff access. Dante may have assets in the area I'm not aware of. Torres nodded. He made no notes. He didn't need to. The guests, he said. Celeste Vaughn. I want her alive and available to talk, Valentina said. She's not the problem. She's been told a story, and she believed it. That's not criminality, that's poor judgment. She considered. Keep her out of the main room during the early phase. And Dante. Dante does not leave the property until I say. Torres looked at her steadily. Understood. Valentina gathered the files and handed them to Kessler. One more thing, she said. The broadcast. Reyes has the distribution list? Every family that maintains diplomatic contact with the Romano organization, Reyes said from the doorway where she had been standing for the past 5 minutes, quiet as smoke. She was 44, Vietnamese American, with a particular gift for occupying space without drawing attention to it. 14 families in North America, 3 in Europe, 2 in South America. The Volkov Syndicate's own external contacts, the ones who are aware of the Volkov-Romano negotiation. She paused. And the 3 federal task force handlers I've identified who monitor organized crime in this region. Valentina looked at her. The federal people get the Volkov documentation specifically, not the internal organization material. Correct. I've prepared a separate package, anonymous, encrypted, routed through 4 relay points. How long after the broadcast do we expect the Volkov collapse to begin? Depending on which federal handler moves first, Reyes said, 30 to 90 days. Volkov's operation has significant exposure in the Northeast. The documentation we're providing identifies 3 cash businesses used as laundering fronts, 2 compromised freight handlers, and the name of Volkov's primary contact in the Port Authority. She said this the same way she might discuss a shipping schedule. Once that information is in federal hands, the investigation timeline runs itself. Valentina nodded slowly. Outside, the sky was beginning to go lighter at its edges. She had been awake for 22 hours. She didn't feel it particularly. She had a body that ran on a particular kind of tension, a physiological efficiency that had always increased in proportion to the complexity of the problem in front of her. Sleep was something she did when there was nothing more useful to do with the time. We go on the 14th, she said. She stood, buttoned her jacket, and walked out of the office into the gray morning without looking back. Tarmek. The 9 days between that morning and the 14th passed the way the days before significant things always pass. Slower than the days on either side of them, with a texture that was slightly off, like a note held just past the point where it resolves. Dante felt something during those days, though he would not have been able to name it with accuracy. A low-grade friction, a sense of the air being slightly denser than it should have been, the way pressure builds before a weather system moves through. He dismissed it. He had been experiencing elevated alertness for months, ever since the Volkov conversations had progressed past the preliminary stage, and he had learned to interpret his own nervousness as excitement. It was a useful self-deception, and he was accomplished at it. He called Celeste on the 11th. They spoke for 41 minutes. He told her the timeline was firm. She asked him 3 questions. He answered 2 of them. On the 12th, Dante met with a capo named Sully Brecht at a restaurant in the city's financial district. Brecht was 50, heavy-set, with the kind of careful loyalty that ran on calculation rather than sentiment. He had been with the organization for 18 years and had maintained a professional relationship with both Dante and Valentina that was precisely calibrated to be useful to whoever was holding the most weight on any given day. Dante told him things were about to change. He was careful with his language. No specifics about Valentina, nothing that could be quoted back to anyone with precision. He suggested that there were developments coming and that Brecht should be thinking about his position in the new structure. Brecht listened. He nodded in the places where nodding was appropriate. He said he appreciated being kept informed. That evening, Brecht drove to a secondary parking garage 2 miles from his restaurant and used a disposable phone to call a number Reyes had given him 3 months ago, the first time she had approached him as part of what she had described as an internal security protocol. He reported the conversation with Dante in detail. He did not embellish. He was precise. Reyes noted the report in the intelligence log with a timestamp and a single observation. Escalating. Timeline confirmed. On the 13th, Valentina returned to the estate through the secure underground access that Dante did not know existed, and spent 2 hours with Torres reviewing the security configuration. Every exit point, main gate, service entrance, cliff access stairs, the 2 secondary access roads, was covered. The internal security doors, electromagnetic locks set into the mansion's original structure years ago during a renovation Dante had been told was cosmetic, were confirmed operational. She stood in the estate's east gallery and looked at the wall display, a 12-foot high-definition screen installed 3 years ago as an art installation that also happened to be connected to a secure projection system in the room beneath. She confirmed the display was connected to Kessler's projection files. She tested the resolution at 20 feet. She tested it at 40. The documents were legible from every point in the room. She looked at the painting hanging beside the display, a large abstract work, mostly dark blue with threads of red moving through it, and thought about nothing in particular for 30 seconds. Then she went back downstairs. On the night of the 14th, Dante brought Celeste to the estate through the main gate at 8:30 p.m. The gate guard on duty was one of Torres's people. He logged the entry, confirmed the guest registration Dante had submitted through the normal household process, and triggered a silent notification to Torres's operational channel. Torres noted it, confirmed the secondary teams were in position, and sent a single-word message to Valentina's phone. Confirmed. Inside the estate, Dante and Celeste moved through the main rooms with the particular energy of people who have been constrained for too long and have suddenly been released into space. He showed her rooms she had never seen. He opened bottles he had been saving. He walked her through the West Wing, where the most significant art was hung, and spoke about each piece with a proprietary ease that had nothing to do with actual ownership and everything to do with the intoxication of proximity to beautiful things. "This place," Celeste said, standing in the center of the great room. She turned in a slow circle, taking in the ceilings and the windows and the ocean visible beyond the glass. "This place is something else." "This is the center of it," Dante said. He stood with his glass at his side, looking at the room the way a man looks at something he has been wanting for so long that wanting has become its own form of possession. Every major decision that has shaped this city, this organization, the people who actually run things, it's all happened in this room. She built all of this? He looked at her. Something moved in his amber eyes. "She assembled it," he said. "There's a difference." Celeste looked at him for a moment. "What's the difference?" "Assembly is putting pieces together," he said. "Building is knowing where the foundation is." He took a drink. "She knows what she has. She doesn't know what it needs." It was the closest he had come, in her presence, to saying what he actually meant about Valentina. She filed it away without comment. They moved to the terrace as the clock pushed toward midnight. The same terrace, the same wind, the same stone railing above the same 200-foot drop to the white churning water below. Celeste thought briefly that she did not like this terrace and pushed the thought aside. Dante leaned on the railing and said, "After this week, things move fast." "How fast?" "Volkov's people are positioned. The moment the structure changes, they're ready to move on the northeast assets." He turned to look at her. "By the end of the month, the reorganization is done, and I sit at the head of this." Celeste held her glass with both hands. "And Valentina," she said. "Valentina," he said, "is handled." The words sat between them in the ocean wind. Inside the estate, at that precise moment, every chandelier in every room came on simultaneously at full intensity. The music that had been playing softly through the house's system, something European and ambient, cut off mid-phrase. From somewhere deep in the structure came a sound that was felt more than heard, the solid, conclusive engagement of 12 electromagnetic door locks sealing every external exit. Dante turned from the railing. The terrace doors opened. Torres stood in the doorway with 2 members of the security team flanking him. His expression was the expression of a man doing a specific job, nothing extra, nothing personal. "Mr. Moretti," he said, "Miss Romano would like to see you in the great room." Dante stood very still. The champagne flute was in his right hand. His left hand had gone flat against the railing behind him, fingers pressing into the stone as if he were trying to find something solid to anchor to. The color in his face had shifted, not dramatically, but perceptibly, a subtle withdrawal of blood from the surface. "Valentina is in Geneva," he said. Torres looked at him with the particular neutrality of someone who has nothing to prove. "Mr. Moretti." Dante set the flute down on the railing. He looked at Celeste. Something passed across his face. Not guilt, not quite, Something more like the recalibration of a man who has been operating on one set of assumptions and is beginning to understand that the ground beneath those assumptions is not what he thought it was. He straightened his jacket. He walked toward the terrace doors. At the top of the great room's main staircase, the lights were on at full intensity, and from the floor below came the sound of movement, controlled, purposeful, and the faint electrical hum of the wall display warming to life. Valentina Romano was already on the stairs. She descended slowly, one hand light on the banister, wearing a black dress that was simple and architectural, cut to suggest nothing except that the person wearing it had thought about it once and made a final decision. Her dark hair was back. Her face was, as it almost always was, completely composed. Not composed in the sense of controlled, but composed in the sense of a document that has been finalized and is no longer accepting revisions. Behind her, moving in quiet formation, were 6 of the organization's most senior captains, people who had been with the Romano organization for years, people whose loyalty was not theoretical. Dante stopped at the foot of the stairs. Valentina reached the bottom step and stopped there, so that she was looking directly at him, level, unhurried. The wall display behind her had come to full brightness. On it, in crisp high definition at a resolution legible from the back of the room, were the first pages of the ownership documentation, the estate, the casinos, the shipping companies, the offshore accounts, the entire corporate architecture of the Romano organization reduced to the clean legal clarity of documents that said, without ambiguity, what belonged to whom. Dante looked at the display. He looked at Valentina. The room was very quiet. "You were never in Geneva," he said. "No," she said. "How long?" She considered the question, not because she didn't know the answer, she knew it to the day, but because she was deciding how much of the answer to give him. "Long enough," she said. Dante's jaw moved. He looked again at the display, at the names and figures and corporate designations that represented everything he had spent 14 months trying to understand and circumvent. He looked at it the way a man looks at a lock he has spent months trying to pick when he realizes the door was never locked against him, specifically. It was simply not a door he was ever meant to open. "Half of this," he started. "Show him," Valentina said. Kessler stepped forward from the edge of the room. He had been there, patient and entirely still, since before Dante came down the stairs, and engaged the display's secondary feed. The document scrolled with the unhurried confidence of something that has been prepared carefully for exactly this moment. Every property, every LLC, every trust, every offshore entity, every corporate structure through which the Romano organization existed in the legal world. 347 separate documents, reduced to a single clear chain of ownership, every line terminated in one name. Dante stared at it. His face was doing something complex and poorly managed. The amber eyes moving across the display with a speed that was for the first time entirely uncontrolled. The muscle beneath his left eye had started to move again. His breathing, which he had been managing through sheer discipline since he came down the stairs, was no longer quite as managed as it had been 30 seconds ago. "There has to be," he started. "There isn't," Kessler said. He said it without inflection. Dante's hand moved toward the inside of his jacket. It was a reflex, or something that had lived in the space between decision and reflex for long enough that the distinction no longer mattered. It lasted less than 2 seconds. Torres was faster. The 2 men flanking Torres were faster than that. Dante's arm was brought back and held, cleanly and without damage, before his hand had cleared the fabric. The pistol, a compact semi-automatic that had been there, presumably, since he'd dressed for the evening, was removed and handed off in a single efficient motion. Dante stood held between 2 members of the security team, breathing hard now, all the management gone, something raw and ragged at the surface of his face. Valentina watched him. She had the expression of a person observing something that is proceeding exactly as predicted, with neither satisfaction nor disappointment, just the particular quality of attention of someone who built the situation and is now watching it complete itself. "Dante," she said. He looked at her. His jaw was tight. His eyes were wet at the edges, not from grief, but from the specific physiological response of a man whose body had processed what his mind was still refusing to accept. "The Volkov documents," she said. Rhea stepped forward and engaged the display's third feed. The recordings began to play. Celeste Vaughn stood in the doorway of the terrace, having been guided there by a member of the security team who had positioned himself between her and the main room with a courtesy that was also an instruction. She watched the recordings play. The voices, the dates, the specifics of what Dante had offered and what Volkov had promised in return, and felt something happen in her chest that was not quite fear and not quite surprise, but some specific compound of both. The feeling of a woman who has been told a story for 14 months and is now watching, in high definition, the parts of the story she was never shown. She thought of the terrace conversation the week before. She's handled. She thought of what handled meant in the world Dante had described to her in the careful, glamorous, edited version he had always presented. She wrapped her arms around herself. On the display, Dante's voice said something about a timeline. In the room below the display, Dante said nothing at all. The recordings played to the end. The room stayed quiet. Valentina looked at her husband, the word landing in her mind with a peculiar flatness, like a key that used to open something and now fits nothing, and said with the complete evenness of a woman who had made this decision weeks ago and was now simply executing it, "You wanted to know where you stand." She gestured at the display. "Now you know." The silence held, and somewhere on the floor above them, a door that had been locked for the last 40 minutes opened with a soft pneumatic hiss, and footsteps that Dante had never heard before began to descend toward the great room. Valentina did not look up. She had been expecting them. The footsteps came down slowly, not with the deliberate theater of someone performing an entrance, just measured, unhurried, the sound of a person who had been waiting in a room upstairs for exactly as long as was necessary and was now done waiting. The staircase curved at the landing, and for a moment there was just the sound, and then the man came into view. He was perhaps 60, compact, with the kind of physical economy that comes not from the gym, but from decades of operating in conditions that did not permit waste. His hair was white at the temples and gray everywhere else, cut short and without vanity. His face was the face of a man who had long ago stopped managing his expressions for the benefit of other people. Not hard exactly, but settled, finished, like a document that had been revised many times and finally notarized. He wore a dark suit and no tie. His hands were at his sides. His name was Caruso. Just Caruso. In the 14 years Dante had spent inside the Romano organization, he had heard the name perhaps a dozen times, always in contexts that were brief and imprecise, the way people mention a structural element of a building without explaining its load-bearing function. He stopped at the foot of the stairs, a few feet from where Torres's men held Dante, and looked at the wall display with the patient attention of a man reviewing something he already knew. Then he looked at Dante. "You don't know who I am," Caruso said. It was not a question. It was an observation, and the quality of it, the complete absence of either satisfaction or contempt, was somehow more unnerving than either emotion would have been. Dante said nothing. His jaw was working slightly, the muscles beneath the skin moving without producing speech. His arms were still held. He had stopped testing the grip. He was not a stupid man, and he had understood within the first 10 seconds that Torres's people were not holding him symbolically. 14 years, Caruso said. You sat at tables where I was discussed. You attended meetings where decisions were made that referenced my work. You ate in rooms where the money I helped structure was sitting in the walls, essentially, in the form of legitimate assets. He tilted his head slightly. And you never once asked who I was. I'm asking now, Dante said. His voice was rough. He had found it again, or found a version of it. Caruso looked at him for another moment. Then he looked at Valentina. He's asking now, he said, with no particular inflection. Valentina was standing at the edge of the room near the display. She had not moved since the recordings ended. She had a glass of water. Not champagne, not wine, water. And she was holding it at her side the way someone holds a thing they've forgotten they're holding. Her face had the quality of the very still surface of deep water, smooth, and beneath the smoothness, unreadable. Caruso runs the structural layer, she said, the actual architecture of the organization, the corporate frameworks, the offshore structures, the real relationships with the families who matter. She paused. Everything you thought I managed alone. You do manage it alone, Dante said. There was something desperate in the precision of his objection, the need to correct a specific detail in the middle of everything collapsing. I manage the direction, Valentina said. Caruso manages the mechanism. She looked at him steadily. He's been with the Romano organization for 22 years. He was here before I took over. He was here before my uncle. She let that settle. He is, in the relevant sense, the organization's institutional memory. Everything I have built with him. Dante stared at her. And you never told me. No. For 14 years. Yes. Something shifted in Dante's face. A final recalibration. The last adjustment of a man who has been revising his understanding of a situation and has reached the bottom of the revision. What was left after the revision was not anger exactly, or not only anger. It was something older and more corrosive. The specific humiliation of a person who has believed themselves to be a participant in something and has just been shown with documentary precision that they were furniture. Why, he said. It came out flat. Not a question in the interrogative sense, more like a thing he needed to say out loud so that it existed somewhere outside himself. Valentina looked at him for a long moment. Because you would have tried to use it, she said. The room was quiet. Caruso moved to a chair along the east wall and sat down without ceremony, the way a man sits when he expects to be in a room for a while. One of the senior captains, a woman named Ferris, early 50s, with cropped silver hair and the careful stillness of someone who had been operating at this level long enough to have no leftover reactions, moved slightly to his right, positioning herself with the unconscious spatial awareness of long professional association. Celeste Vaughn was still in the terrace doorway. The security man had not moved. She had not moved. She was watching the room with her arms still crossed over her chest, the silk robe over whatever she'd been wearing, and her face had gone through several things in the past 10 minutes and had arrived, currently, at a particular blankness that was not shock but something more deliberate. A woman deciding in real time what her options were. She was good at that. She had always been good at that. The problem was that the man who had constructed her options for the past 14 months was currently standing held between two members of a private security team in the great room of an estate he did not own, and the architecture of everything he had described to her was not what it had appeared to be. The casinos, the offshore accounts, the family structure, the power she had been told he was about to assume. None of it was his. None of it had ever been his. She thought about the $400,000, the transfers, the gifts, the trips, the apartment in the city where they had spent 41 nights over 11 months. She thought about the specific words he had used when he described what was coming. The empire, the organization, what belongs to us, us. She had never entirely believed the us. She had always understood, in the practical and unsentimental part of herself, that she had learned early to keep separate from the rest of her, that she was a variable in his plan rather than a party to it. But she had believed in the plan itself. She had believed in the existence of the thing he was describing. That, she now understood, had been the real mistake. She unwrapped her arms. She looked at the security man beside her. "I need to speak," she said. Her voice was steady. "To whoever is in charge." The security man looked across the room. Torres, who had been watching her with peripheral attention since she'd spoken, gave a small nod. "Miss Romano," Torres said. Valentina turned. Celeste looked at her from the doorway. Across the distance of the great room, the two women looked at each other for several seconds, the measurement of a silence that contained more information than anything said in it. "I'll tell you everything I know," Celeste said. "All of it. The meetings, the intermediaries, the conversations, the people he used." She paused. "I want to be clear that I had no part in whatever he was planning to do to you specifically." "I know," Valentina said. Something shifted in Celeste's face. She had prepared for resistance. The lack of it was harder to navigate than argument would have been. "Then, You're not my concern tonight, Valentina said. It was not a reassurance and it was not a threat. It was a statement of operational fact, delivered the way Valentina delivered most things, with the clean efficiency of a person who has allocated her attention carefully and is not in the habit of misallocating it. She turned back to Dante. He had been watching the exchange between the two women with a particular quality of attention, the fierce, helpless focus of a man who is no longer in a position to affect outcomes and has redirected every cognitive resource toward observing them. His face had settled into something hard, not the controlled hardness of his usual presentation, but the underlying kind, the structural material that had always been there beneath the management. "Celeste," he said. She looked at him. "Don't," he said. She looked at him for a long time, long enough that the silence had its own weight, its own shape. "You told me you had this," she said. Her voice was quiet and entirely without heat, which was more cutting than anger would have been. "You told me the structure was set, that the assets were accessible, that the moment things moved, you had the organization's loyalty." She paused. "You told me she was handled. She is... Look around the room, Dante." He looked around the room. Torres. The two men holding his arms, Ferris and two other senior captains along the east wall, Caruso in his chair, Reyes near the display, Kessler at the table with the accordion files, the security team positioned at the entry points, visible through the doorways at clean intervals. He looked at the wall display, his voice on the recording saying the timeline was firm. He looked at Valentina. "You planned this for months," he said. "Yes. You let me keep going. You let me make the contacts, the meetings with Volkov's people." His voice had an edge in it now, something between accusation and the dawning of a specific understanding. "You could have stopped it earlier." "I could have," Valentina agreed. "Why didn't you?" She considered how much to give him. She was not by nature a person who explained herself, not because she lacked the capacity, but because the habit of explanation implied a need for ratification that she had never felt. But there was something here that was not purely operational, something in the specific shape of his question, the "why didn't you?" that she decided deserved a precise answer. "Because stopping it early would have left open questions," she said. "The extent of the Volkov contact, which assets you'd actually compromised and which you'd only offered, which members of the organization you'd approached." She looked at him steadily. "I needed to see how far you'd go. And now you know. Now I know." Dante's jaw tightened. The amber eyes moved across the room again, checking angles, weighing options, running the calculations of a man whose body has not yet accepted what his mind is beginning to understand. He was still looking for an exit. She could see it, the precise, futile industry of it, the way a locked room inspires people to press on walls that aren't doors. "The Volkov agreement," he said. "Even if you move on me, even if all of this goes exactly the way you're planning, Volkov's people have the preliminary information already. The safe house locations, the transfer channel contacts, they move on that independently and you have an exposure problem regardless." It was a good argument, structurally. She acknowledged this internally without showing it. "Reyes," Valentina said. Reyes turned from the display. "The preliminary information Dante provided to Volkov's intermediaries was prepared by my office," she said. Her voice had the same flat precision it always had. "Safe house addresses that are no longer operational. Transfer channel contacts who have been briefed. The Rotterdam logistics contact is one of ours." She paused. "Everything Dante gave Volkov is either expired, monitored, or a directed feed." Dante stared at her. Then slowly, he looked at Valentina. She said nothing. She simply let him work through it, the full architectural scope of what he was looking at, the understanding arriving at its own pace, in its own sequence. He had spent 14 months gathering intelligence on an organization that had been quietly feeding him a curated version of itself. He had built a plan around operational information that was, in its critical elements, a controlled narrative. He had negotiated with Volkov's people using assets that were either expired, monitored, or traps. And every meeting, every payment, every conversation he'd had over 14 months had been logged, documented, and assembled into the files currently sitting in Kessler's accordion folders. His plan had not been a plan. It had been a performance, staged in a theater he had not known existed, for an audience of one. The sound that came out of him was not words. It was something shorter and more involuntary. A single hard exhalation, like something physical leaving the body. His chest moved with it and then settled. His face, which had been cycling through various controlled and uncontrolled states since he came down the stairs, went very still. "How long?" he said. His voice was different now, stripped of the layering, the management, just the material underneath. "From the beginning?" Valentina was quiet for a moment. "From the Volkov contact," she said. "Month 4. He absorbed this. "And before that?" A pause. Something moved at the edge of her expression. Not the answer to his question, but the acknowledgement that the question had a real answer, which was its own kind of answer. "Before that," she said carefully, "there were things I chose not to know." The silence that followed this was different from the other silences in the room. It was heavier, more specific. The weight of a thing that had been in the space between two people for a long time and had never been named. Dante looked at her. Something moved in his face that was not anger and was not calculation. It was for a moment just a man looking at a woman he had been married to for 10 years through the specific wreckage of everything that had led to this room. "We could have," he started. "Don't," she said. Quiet, precise, final. He stopped. She picked up the water glass, took a drink, and set it down. The gesture was entirely ordinary, and in the context of the room it was somehow devastating. "Torres," she said. "Ma'am. Take him to the east wing, the second room. I want someone on the door and I want the window access disabled." She looked at Dante one more time, not with heat, not with cold, with the specific quality of a woman completing a task that had been on her list for a long time. "We'll finish this in the morning." Torres moved. His men moved. Dante did not resist. There was nothing left in his posture that suggested resistance as an option. He walked between them with the mechanical compliance of a man who has been running a particular engine for years and has just understood, at a cellular level, that there is no more fuel. He did not look at Celeste as they moved him through the doorway. She watched him go. The room reconfigured around his absence. People shifting position, the quality of the air changing, the particular pressure that had been building since the chandelier came on beginning to release. Caruso stood from his chair. "The Volkov timeline," he said to Valentina. Just that. He didn't elaborate because he didn't need to. They had been working together for 22 years, and the shorthand was efficient. "Reyes has the federal package ready," Valentina said. "We move on transmission in 48 hours. I want to see confirmation the Volkov contact received the second set of misdirected coordinates before we send." Caruso nodded. "The families," Ferris said. She had not spoken until now, and the room adjusted slightly to her voice, low, measured, with the authority of someone who had earned the right to speak minimally and be heard immediately. The broadcast, the 14 families. "Morning," Valentina said, "after I've spoken with him." "He'll try to negotiate," Ferris said. "Not as a concern, as a calibration." "I know." "He'll offer the Volkov contact names directly, try to trade them for a position." "He doesn't have contact names," Reyes said. "His intermediary handled all direct communication. The intermediary has been ours for 8 months. Ferris looked at her. "He doesn't know that." "No," Reyes said. "He doesn't." A brief silence in which everyone in the room ran the implications of this simultaneously and arrived at the same place. "He'll walk into the morning conversation believing he has a card to play," Valentina said. "That's fine." She set down the water glass and straightened her jacket with the small, decisive gesture of a woman putting an end to one phase of a thing and beginning the next. "Let him believe it." She moved toward the doorway. "Ms. Vaughn," she said without stopping, addressing Celeste across the room. Celeste straightened. "Yes. There's a guest room prepared in the north wing. Torres will have someone take you." Valentina paused at the threshold. "I'll want to speak with you in the morning as well, before I speak with him." Celeste processed this. "All right." Get some sleep if you can. Celeste looked at her. In the brightness of the great room, in the aftermath of everything, there was something in Valentina Romano's face that was very hard to read. Not cold, not warm, not the face of a victor or the face of a wife. Something older and more specific. The face of a person who has been working toward a particular point for a long time and has arrived and is not done arriving yet. "Can I ask you something?" Celeste said. Valentina waited. "Did you know about me from the start?" A pause. "Yes," Valentina said. Celeste took this in. Did it? She started, then stopped, recalibrated. Did it matter to you, the personal part? Valentina looked at her for a moment. Really looked, in a way she hadn't quite done before. The direct, assessing quality of her attention turned fully on the younger woman, taking in the damp hair and the wrong robe, and the particular steadiness of someone who had navigated difficult rooms long enough to know how to hold themselves inside them. "Yes," Valentina said. "It mattered." She walked out of the room. The remaining people redistributed themselves. Reyes to the communication station in the adjacent study, Kessler gathering his files with the unhurried efficiency of a man who has done this particular kind of work for 30 years, Caruso pausing near the doorway and looking once more at the wall display before he too turned and walked out through the back passage. Ferris spoke quietly to the two remaining security personnel, gesturing toward the external access points, running the overnight protocol. Celeste stood in the great room alone for a moment. The wall display was still on. The ownership documents were still there. In high definition, the corporate chains and trust instruments and offshore structures laid out in the clean impersonal language of legal documentation. Her eyes moved across the page without absorbing the details. She knew the relevant detail, which was that the name appearing on every terminal line was not the name of the man she had spent 11 months constructing a version of her future around. She looked at the terrace through the glass. The doors had been closed. Beyond them, the ocean was still there. The wind still moving the darkness above the cliff, the water still breaking white 200 feet below. She thought about the word us. Then she stopped thinking about it and followed the security man to the north wing. The East Wing guest room was clean and bare in the way of rooms that are maintained rather than inhabited. Fresh linens, no personal objects, the kind of anonymous care that a well-run estate provides to spaces that are used irregularly. There was a window that would not open. There was a single chair, a lamp, and a table. The door closed behind the two security men, and the soft engagement of the magnetic lock was audible, a small, definitive sound. Dante stood in the center of the room. He had been running for the past 3 hours on the particular neurological cocktail of threat response and strategic calculation that had sustained him through difficult situations before. He was good under pressure. He had always known this about himself, and it was one of the few self-assessments he had ever made that was entirely accurate. He could maintain function in conditions that shut other people down. He could think while the room was burning, but there is a specific limit to that capacity, and he had hit it. He sat down in the chair. He put his elbows on the table and his face in his hands, and he stayed that way for a long time. The intermediary. He kept coming back to that. Reyes had said it so cleanly, so without emphasis, the intermediary has been ours for 8 months, that it had almost passed him on first hearing. But now, in the silence of the locked room, it was the thing that would not sit down. His intermediary was a man named Pell, Marcus Pell. Dante had known him for 4 years through a property development contact, had identified him as someone with connections to both worlds, legitimate business and organized crime adjacent, who was sufficiently motivated by money and sufficiently uninvested in loyalty to any particular faction to be useful. He had been careful with Pell. He had been more careful with Pell than with anything else in the past 14 months. He had not been careful enough. 8 months. Reyes said 8 months, which meant that for 2 of the 14 months of his operation, he had been running on genuine intelligence. For the following 8 months, while he had believed he was building something, he had been providing. Everything he thought he knew about the organization's operational layer, the information he had used as the foundation of his negotiation with Volkov, had been shaped, curated, and delivered to him by people whose job it was to shape, curate, and deliver. He thought about the Geneva story. Valentina had led him believe she was in Geneva. She had not gone to Geneva. She had been here, beneath this house, in a room he didn't know existed, watching through cameras he didn't know existed. For how long? He didn't know. He couldn't know. The foundation of his understanding of his own home, his own marriage, his own position, had been demonstrably incorrect in ways he had not discovered until they were shown to him at full resolution on a 12-foot display. His hands, he noticed, were shaking slightly. Not dramatically, just a fine tremor, the kind the body produces when it has been running hot for too long without rest. He pressed them flat on the table. He needed to think about the morning. Valentina had said they would finish this in the morning. The word finish carried a very specific weight in the context of a mafia organization, a weight that was not symbolic, and he was under no illusions about what the range of outcomes looked like. He had ordered this himself in various forms 4 times over the course of his involvement with the Romano organization. He knew what the preparation looked like. He knew what the conversation before it looked like. Reyes had said the intermediary was theirs, but Reyes had said this in a room full of people as part of a demonstration of operational control. The function of the statement was to break him down, to show him the full scope of the architecture he'd been living inside without knowing it. It was a precision instrument, that statement, and precision instruments are sometimes deployed for their effect rather than their literal truth. Maybe the intermediary had been turned. Maybe Pell had been turned 8 months ago, and everything since was constructed. Or maybe Pell had been turned more recently, and Reyes had moved the date backward to make the operation look more complete than it was. Maybe Dante still had a card. He didn't know. He genuinely didn't know, which was itself a kind of information. He had been so thoroughly managed that he could no longer distinguish between his actual knowledge and the curated version. But even a card that might not exist was worth playing, if the alternative was the morning conversation with nothing. He sat in the chair and worked through it. The information he had given Volkov's people, the 3 safe house addresses, if they were real, if they were operational, they represented genuine leverage, something Valentina would want to contain rather than expose further. If he had even one real piece of information, one operational detail that was genuinely compromised rather than deliberately misdirected, it was a negotiating position. Not a strong one, but a position. He thought about what Valentina had said. Before that, there were things I chose not to know. He had heard this and filed it under the general category of what she had said. But now, in the quiet of the locked room, he took it out and looked at it more carefully. Things I chose not to know. Not things she didn't know, things she chose not to know. There was a distinction in that, and the distinction was what it was. She had known, at some level, before month 4. She had known, or suspected, or seen enough of the edges of it to make a choice about how much to look. And she had chosen, for some period of time, not to look. That was not the behavior of a woman who felt nothing. He wasn't going to try to use that tomorrow. He was not that stupid. But he noted it in the way he noted things that might matter, filed it in the category of real information versus constructed information. Whatever Valentina Romano felt about their marriage, whatever had been there and had been real and had existed in the space between what they were to the world and what they actually were to each other, that was not engineered. That was not Reyes feeding him a curated narrative. That was real. He didn't know what to do with it. He sat in the chair and turned it over and could not find the edge to pull on. Outside the room, beyond the locked door and the security detail, the house was very quiet. The chandeliers had been dimmed. The surveillance cameras were still running. Somewhere in the structure beneath the house, in the rooms he now knew existed, the organization was continuing its work. Reyes at the communication station, the federal package moving toward transmission, the trap closing on Volkov's operation with the clean inevitability of something that had been in motion for months. He was inside the trap. He was the thing the trap had been built to catch, and it had caught him, and the morning was going to be a specific kind of conversation with a specific kind of range of outcomes. He put his face back in his hands. He thought about the shaking, the fine tremor still in his fingers when he lifted them from the table. He thought about what it meant that his body was doing that. Not weakness, not fear in the simple sense, but the physiological response of a man who had been operating on the certainty of his own intelligence and was now processing at a level below cognition what it meant to have been wrong. Not just wrong, wrong inside someone else's design. He stayed in the chair until a gray light began at the edges of the window. He did not sleep. He rehearsed conversations. He discarded them and built new ones. He sat with the tremor in his hands and let it run its course. When the morning came and the magnetic lock disengaged with its soft, definitive sound, and Torres's voice came through the door with the even courtesy of a man who is doing a professional task, and nothing more, Dante stood up. He straightened his jacket. He walked to the door. And somewhere in the East Wing corridor, where the morning light was coming thin and precise through the window at the far end, he understood, not as metaphor, not as abstraction, but as the specific physical sensation of a floor that is no longer there beneath your feet. That whatever he was walking toward, whatever conversation Valentina had prepared for the morning, he was walking into it with nothing. Not one card. Not one real piece of information that wasn't already in her files. Not one lever that she had not already accounted for. The door opened. He walked through it. The corridor was 16 feet long and ended at a window that faced east. Dante counted the steps without meaning to. 11, on the polished hardwood floor, past a console table with nothing on it, past a framed architectural drawing of the estate's original structure that he had walked past perhaps 1,000 times without ever stopping to read. He stopped now. The drawing was detailed, precise, the work of a draftsman who had cared about accuracy. He could see the outline of the main rooms, the service corridors, the structural walls. He could also see, in the lower left quadrant of the drawing, a room that did not correspond to any room he had ever entered or known about. He stood there for 4 seconds. Then he walked on. Torres was at the end of the corridor with one man beside him. Morning light came through the east window behind them, flat and gray and without warmth, the particular light of a coast morning before the sun has cleared the marine layer. Torres had the look of a man who had slept 4 hours and didn't need more. Not rested exactly, but functional in the specific way of people who had trained themselves to perform on minimal recovery because the work required it. "She's in the study," Torres said. Dante said nothing. He walked. The study was on the ground floor, east side of the house, a room Valentina had always used for work that required sustained concentration rather than the performance of authority. It was smaller than the great room, furnished without display. A large work table, 2 chairs across from it, bookshelves along the back wall that held actual books and actual files rather than the decorative spines that filled the shelves in the rooms they used for meetings with people who needed to be impressed. There was a window that looked out over the side garden, currently gray-green in the morning fog. There was a coffee service on a side table. Valentina was at the work table when he came in. She was reading something. A printed document, 3 pages, which she finished before she looked up. She was still in the black dress. She had not slept. The only evidence of the night in her appearance was a very slight tension around her eyes, the kind that comes not from fatigue but from sustained, precise work, the physiological residue of a mind that had been running at capacity for hours. She set the document down. She looked at him. "Sit," she said. He sat in the chair across the table. The chairs were not positioned confrontationally. They were angled slightly, the way chairs are positioned for a conversation rather than an interrogation. He noted this and filed it in the category of information about what kind of morning this was going to be. Torres remained at the door. The other man was gone. Valentina poured 2 cups of coffee from the service and set one in front of him. He didn't reach for it immediately. She drank from hers, set it down, and folded her hands on the table. "Tell me about Pell," she said. He looked at her. "You already know about Pell." "I know what Reyes knows about Pell. I'm asking what you know." He processed this. The distinction was, on its surface, the distinction between an interrogation and a conversation. He was not sure which this was. "We met through Carrington," he said. "Property development contact, 3.5 years ago." "I know how you met him. Tell me what you knew about him." "Motivated by money, no fixed loyalty. Comfortable in both worlds." He paused. "Careful. Not brilliant, but careful." "What did he tell you about us?" "The U.S. landed with its full weight." He registered it and continued. He confirmed the operational structure of the Northeast assets, the safe house locations, the transfer channel contacts. He said his source was inside the logistics layer. His source was Reyes, Valentina said. I know that now. Pell has been working with Reyes for 8 months. Before that, he was working with you genuinely. She picked up her coffee again. For approximately 6 months, the intelligence he gave you was real. Dante went very still. The first 4 contacts, he said slowly. The first 4 contacts, Valentina confirmed, before Reyes identified him and made her approach. He sat with this. 6 months of real intelligence. He tried to run backwards through what Pell had given him in those first months. The structural information, the asset descriptions, the organizational relationships he had used to build his understanding of what he was working with. 6 months of real information followed by 8 months of controlled feed. Which meant his foundational picture might have genuine elements inside the constructed one. Which meant the question of what was real and what was engineered was not as settled as Reyes had presented it. You're telling me this, he said carefully. Yes. Why? She set the coffee cup down. She looked at him with the particular directness that he had always found, even in the worst of their years together, one of the most genuinely difficult things to sustain eye contact with. Not because it was hostile, but because it was, in the most precise sense, honest. It showed you exactly what it was. A person who had arrived at their positions through thought and was not going to revise them for the comfort of the person being looked at. Because I want to know what you actually have, she said. Not what you thought you had. Not what Pell told you in month 7 or month 10. What you gathered yourself directly in the first months before Reyes made her approach. He looked at her. And what do you offer for that? I haven't offered anything. Then why would I give you what you're asking for? She held his gaze. Because the alternative is that I proceed on the basis of what I know, which includes the assumption that everything you have is compromised, and act accordingly. The word accordingly was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. He understood exactly what it was doing. He breathed out slowly. The tremor in his hands from the night before was gone. He had worked through it during the sleepless hours, or his body had resolved it independently. His hands were flat on the table, still. In month 2, he said, Pell gave me documentation on 2 transfer channels, account structures, the specific banks, the holding layers, the pass-through entities. He paused. I verified them independently through a financial contact I've had for 12 years, someone with no connection to you or the organization. Valentina said nothing. The verification confirmed the channels were real and operational as of 8 months ago, Dante continued. I gave those channels to Volkov's people in month 9. Month 9 was inside Reyes' window, Valentina said. I know, but the underlying documentation was from month 2. Real documentation that I verified independently. Whether Reyes modified what Volkov received, whether the channels were already changed by the time the information was passed, I don't know. Valentina looked at him steadily. Something was moving in her face, very carefully controlled, the surface management that was almost always perfect, almost. The financial contact, she said. Name. He shook his head. Not yet. A pause. She looked at him for a long moment. All right, she said. He had expected pressure. The lack of it told him something, though he couldn't yet read exactly what. He picked up the coffee cup. His hand was steady. He drank and set it down and waited. Valentina turned to a file on the table. She opened it and took out a single document, 1 page printed with the specific layout of an internal report. She turned it face up and slid it across the table. He looked at it. It was a financial summary, transaction records, an account structure he recognized, the architecture of it, the layering, because it was his. Not the account in the Caymans that Reyes had shown in the great room the night before. A different account, older. One he had established 9 years ago through a different structure entirely, using a name he had not used since then, funded through a source he had spent considerable effort insulating. He looked at the document. He looked at Valentina. How? He said. Kessler found the original filing error, she said. It was very small. A single number in the registered agent's address that was transposed. In the Cayman's registry, the transposed address created a linkage to a parent entity that otherwise had no visible connection. She paused. It took a forensic accountant 6 weeks and cost approximately $40,000 to trace. But it traces. Dante looked at the document. The account had been his private reserve, not large by the organization standards, but real and entirely invisible, or so he had believed. 11 years of careful savings, moved in small increments through structures he had built himself, without Pell, without intermediaries, without anyone who could be flipped or fed. The balance shown on the document was accurate to within $800. He sat back in the chair. The coffee was getting cold. He didn't notice. "You've known about this one too," he said, "for 4 months. And you let it sit." "I let it sit." He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Just a moment. A brief upward movement of his eyes before they came back down. The gesture of a man checking a space above him for something that isn't there. "What do you actually want from this conversation?" he said. Not hostile. Genuinely asking. The tiredness was in his voice now. Not the performing tiredness that people use to signal suffering, but the real kind. The structural fatigue of a man who has been running on threat chemistry for 18 hours and has arrived at the point where the chemistry is spent, and what's left is the plain fact of the situation. Valentina looked at him. "I want to know if there is anyone else," she said. He frowned. "Anyone else in the organization?" "Anyone else outside it. Contacts, people you used or approached who I may not have identified. People who have information about the Romano organization's structure that they obtained through you." He thought about this carefully. Not performing thought, actually running through the past 14 months, the people he had spoken to, the contacts he had activated or considered. "3 people," he said after a moment. "2 you already have, Pell, and the logistics contact in Rotterdam who I gave to Volkov. The 3rd is my financial contact, the one who verified the transfer channels." "Who is he?" A pause. "His name is Aldrich," Dante said. "Werner Aldrich. He runs a private wealth management office in Zurich. I've known him for 12 years. He's not a criminal. He's a financial professional who does work for people with complex structures and doesn't ask questions about origins." He met her eyes. "He doesn't know what he verified. He ran the account structures as a routine due diligence check against public registry data. He has no understanding of what he was looking at." Valentina looked at him for a long moment. Then she made a note on the pad beside the file. "Is that everything?" she said. "Yes." She wrote for another moment. Then she set down the pen and looked up. "I believe you," she said. The words landed in a specific way. Not warmly, not as a concession, with the flat authority of a person who has assessed the evidence and reached a conclusion. But real. He felt very distantly the particular weight of being believed by her, the specific gravitational quality of her trust, which he had spent 10 years in proximity to and had apparently spent those same years not fully valuing. He almost said something. Then the door opened. It was not Torres. Torres was still at his position by the door. The person who came through was Reyes, and she came through fast, with the contained velocity of someone who has received information that overrides the protocol of the current room. She had a phone in her hand. She held it out to Valentina. "Brecht?" she said. Valentina took the phone. She read what was on the screen. She read it twice. Her face did not change. The surface stayed exactly what it was. But something happened beneath the surface, a tensioning, like a structural material absorbing force. She set the phone face down on the table. "What?" Dante said. Valentina looked at him. The look was the look of a person who has just received a piece of information that reorganizes the room they are sitting in and is working in real time on the reorganization. "Brecht," she said. "Tell me when you spoke to him." Dante felt something cold begin to move at the base of his neck. "The 12th, he said. 3 days ago. At the restaurant in the financial district. I told him things were about to change. I was careful. I didn't give him specifics. I said there were developments and suggested he think about his position." "What did he say?" "That he appreciated being kept informed." Valentina was quiet. Her hands, which had been folded on the table, had moved slightly. Not dramatically, just the fingers spreading and then pressing flat again, the small physiological response of a controlled person registering an impact. "Reyes," she said. "Brecht made contact with Volkov's operational team last night," Reyes said. Her voice was even, but even for Reyes there was something in it. A tightness at the edges, the vocal equivalent of the room's atmosphere changing. Not through the monitored channels, through a direct line we did not know existed. Dante went cold. "He told them about the meeting with you," Valentina said. He looked at her. "I was careful. I didn't give him—" "He didn't need specifics," Valentina said. "He told them you'd been contained, that the Romano organization's counter-operation was complete. He told them to move independently on the Northeast assets using whatever intelligence they had prior to your last transmission." The silence that followed was very complete. Dante understood what this meant. He ran it forward in the space of 3 seconds and arrived at the full implication with the particular clarity of a mind that, stripped of everything else, was still functional. Volkov's people had been told the Romano organization's counter-operation was complete, which meant they had been told the window was closing, which meant they would accelerate their timeline on the Northeast assets, and the Northeast assets, whether fully real or partially misdirected, represented an exposure that the Romano organization now had to address ahead of its own planned schedule. "Brecht has been with Volkov," Dante said. He heard his own voice as if from a slight distance. "Longer than you," Valentina said. "Reyes." "Preliminary assessment is 18 months, Reyes said. "Brecht's contact with Volkov's network predates your first approach to Pell by approximately 4 months. Dante sat with this. 18 months. Brecht had been in communication with Volkov's people for 18 months, which meant that during the period when Dante had been carefully cultivating Brecht as a potential ally in his reorganization plan, Brecht had been simultaneously feeding information to Volkov. Not about Dante specifically, not initially, but about the organization, its structure, its weaknesses, its pressure points. "What did he give them?" Dante said. "We're still assessing," Reyes said, "but the direct line was active for 18 months. The information scope is significant." "What Brecht knew about the Geneva story," Dante said, the connections assembling themselves with a speed that was almost physical. "I told him you were in Geneva. He told Volkov's people. They would have known I was in position to act," Valentina said. "They would have known the window was open," Dante said. "Not just for me, for them. If Valentina Romano is documented as being out of the country at the time of a power transition in the Romano organization, the federal exposure is managed differently. Volkov's people could move on the Northeast assets, and the first assumption is that it's internal organization restructuring rather than an outside incursion." He was thinking out loud, which he almost never did. It was the exhaustion, and it was the cold clarity that comes after exhaustion, the stripped-down function of a brain that has burned through everything else and is running on pure structural logic. Valentina was watching him, really watching, with the quality of attention she deployed rarely, and he recognized from years of experience the attention she gave things that were actually useful. "Brecht told them the counter-operation was complete," he said. "Meaning he was told the counter-operation was complete. Meaning—" He stopped. He looked at Valentina. "Someone in this organization told Brecht about the counter-operation," he said. The room was very quiet. Reyes, who had been standing 2 feet inside the door, did not move. Torres at the door did not move. Valentina did not move. "Yes," Valentina said. The single syllable landed in the room and stayed there. Dante pressed both hands flat on the table. The tremor was back. Not fine now, more pronounced, but he pressed through it and kept his hands flat and kept his eyes on Valentina's face. "Who?" he said. "We're working on that," Reyes said. "You don't know," Dante said. He looked at Reyes. "You've had the counter-operation running for 14 months. You've had every communication channel monitored. You've had Brecht reporting to you." He felt the shape of this assembling itself in real time, piece by piece, the way a face assembles from individual features. "But you didn't know about Brecht's direct line to Volkov, which means there's a layer of this you didn't have visibility into." Reyes's expression did not change. "Correct," He looked at Valentina. Someone gave Breck the counter-operation timeline. Someone who knew it. Someone who has been inside your planning. Dante, Valentina said, I know what you're going to say. I'm not going to say anything. I'm going to ask you something. She leaned forward very slightly, the precise forward shift of a woman who is about to ask the only question that matters. In the 6 months before Reyes turned Pell, in the period when the intelligence you were receiving was real, did Pell ever mention Brecht? The cold at the base of Dante's neck spread upward. He went back through it. Month 1, month 2, month 3. The careful, methodical conversations with Pell over secured phones and in person at locations they rotated. The information about the organizational structure, the asset documentation, the verification of the transfer channels. Month 3. Pell had mentioned a name, not Brecht, not directly. He had mentioned a senior operational contact with long-standing relationships in the Northeast, who had been expressing private concern about the direction of the organization's leadership over the past 2 years. He had not given a name. He had said the contact was someone Dante would know. He had said the contact had been watching the situation and was not unfriendly to the idea of structural change. Dante had filed this in the category of potential allies to develop. He had been careful not to pursue it aggressively. He had wanted to have more pieces in place before he started activating what he thought of as the internal layer. He had left it as a note to return to. He had never returned to it, because by month 4, Reyes had turned Pell, and everything after that was constructed, and the note he had made in month 3 was sitting in a mental file he had never reopened. Month 3, Dante said. Pell mentioned a senior contact, didn't name him, said he'd been watching the leadership situation, that he wasn't unfriendly to change. Valentina's jaw moved once. He gave you a recruitment lead, she said. He gave me a recruitment lead. I didn't follow it. I wanted more structural pieces first. He gave you a recruitment lead, Valentina said again, more slowly, the words rearranging themselves as she said them, for a person who was already working with Volkov. Dante sat with this. Pell was the bridge, he said, between me and Brecht. Brecht was already in Volkov's network. Pell knew this. He was managing both sides. He looked up. Pell wasn't just your asset and my intermediary. He was also Volkov's intelligence conduit into both operations. Reyes was very still. He played all three, Dante said. The silence in the room was the silence of a calculation completing. Not dramatic. The silence of people who are very good at their work and have just received a piece of information that restructures a problem they thought they understood. Where is Pell now? Valentina said. Her voice was measured, but beneath the measurement was something sharp, something that had been there since Reyes came through the door and had been building in proportion to the emerging picture. He was at his apartment in the city as of last night's check-in, Reyes said. She was already looking at her phone. She paused. The check-in was at 11:40. And now, Valentina said, a pause. A longer pause. I can't reach the handler, Reyes said. The room changed. It was not a visible change, so nobody moved dramatically, nobody's expression became something it wasn't. But the quality of the air shifted, the way the quality of air shifts in a room when a fact enters it that everyone understands simultaneously. Pell had known, as of last night, that the counter-operation had moved into its final phase. Because Brecht knew, and Brecht and Pell were in communication, and if Pell had any professional intelligence at all, he had understood that his position was about to be exposed on multiple sides simultaneously. Pell was gone. The handler, Dante said. Reyes looked up from the phone. Her face had the expression of a person running very fast through a very dark space. She was assigned to maintain physical proximity. She should have been at her vehicle outside his building. She's not responding, Torres said. He had his own phone out. He had been moving in the background, quietly and precisely, while the conversation was happening. Find her, Valentina said. Torres stepped out of the room. His footsteps moved fast down the corridor. Valentina stood from the table. She stood the way she always stood. The back straight, the shoulders settled, the physical posture of a woman who had trained her body to convey something specific, regardless of what was happening internally. But she put one hand on the table for a moment, the hand flat, the weight slightly forward. Just a moment. Then she lifted it. She turned to Reyes. The federal package. Status. Ready for transmission. I was waiting for the Volkov confirmation contact before we sent. Send it now, Valentina said. We haven't confirmed the set. Send it now, Valentina said again. Reyes looked at her. She understood. The planned sequence had been disrupted. The careful choreography of when to move and in what order had been overtaken by the variable of Pell and the handler and the direct line Brecht had been running for 18 months that none of them had known about. The controlled timeline was no longer controlled, which meant the federal package needed to go ahead of whatever Volkov's people were now accelerating toward. Yes, Reyes said, and went out. Valentina turned to Dante. He was still in the chair. He had not moved during the last 4 minutes of the room's rapid reorganization. He had watched it all. Reyes at the door, Torres moving, the sequential impacts of each new element, with the stillness of a man who has recognized that he is no longer inside the situation in any functional sense and has made the practical decision to observe rather than attempt to participate in something he cannot affect. She looked at him. He looked at her. Across the table, across the coffee cups and the document from Kessler and the file she'd opened at the start of the conversation, they looked at each other in the flat gray morning light with the specific quality of two people who have been looking at each other for 10 years from a particular distance and are now finally in the same actual room. Brecht was reporting to you, Dante said. On me. Yes. For 3 months. Yes. But Brecht was also reporting to Volkov for 18 months about the organization. He paused. He was reporting to you about me and to Volkov about everything. It appears so. You used him without knowing what he was. Valentina looked at him. Yes. He watched her say this. It was the hardest thing she had said in this room, not because it was emotionally charged, but because it was a precise acknowledgement of a specific failure. And Valentina Romano did not acknowledge failures casually. He understood what it cost her. He understood this because he had spent 10 years watching her very carefully, even when he was doing other things, even when he was planning things he shouldn't have been planning. The part of him that had always been honestly paying attention to her had never stopped. The handler, he said, Reyes's person outside Pell's building. I know. If Pell made contact with Volkov's people before he ran, I know, Valentina said. He stood up. It was a slow motion, not dramatic, not sudden. He stood the way a man stands when he has been sitting for a long time and his body has more weight than usual. He put his hands in his pockets. He looked at the window, the gray fog over the side garden, the wet green of the grass, a stone path that ran between two low hedges toward the east boundary of the property. Ordinary things, in the ordinary morning, on the other side of the glass. Volkov's people know the counter-operation is complete, he said. They know you're in position to move. They've been given the signal to accelerate. He turned from the window. If Pell has confirmed that the chain of command is disrupted, that you have an internal breach, that your intelligence network has a compromised element, they won't wait for the Northeast assets. They'll move on the organization directly. Yes, Valentina said. This house, he said. She looked at him. This house is the center of the organization, he said. It's the symbolic and operational center. It's where you are right now. He looked at the window again. If I were Volkov's operational team, and I had just been told that the Romano organization was mid-transition, intelligence breach confirmed, key personnel isolated, he stopped. How many people does Volkov have in this region? Valentina moved to the door. Torres, she called. Torres's voice came from down the corridor, not far. Already moving the external perimeter. She turned back to the room. The morning light through the window was still gray. The fog over the garden had not moved. The stone path between the hedges was still empty and wet and entirely ordinary. And somewhere on the road that wound up the cliff face toward the estate's main gate, headlights were moving through the marine layer, steady and unhurried, the way vehicles move when they are confident of their destination and have no reason to approach fast, because fast is only necessary when you think someone is watching, and Pell had told them no one was. Valentina looked at the window. She reached into the inside pocket of her jacket and took out a phone, not the one from the desk, a different one, smaller, matte black, and made a call. It rang 4 times. On the 5th ring, a voice answered, male, very calm, no identifiable accent. "Tell me," the voice said. "Activate the secondary protocol," Valentina said. "Full perimeter, now." A pause of perhaps 2 seconds. Then, "Understood." She ended the call. She set the phone on the table. She looked at Dante. He was still standing near the window. His face was, for the first time in the 18 hours since this had begun, entirely without strategy. Not empty, but stripped to the material, the person without the performance. And what was there was not what she had expected. It was not collapse. It was not the calculated composure of a man preserving his options. It was something quieter and more specific. The face of a man who has understood, completely and without argument, that the architecture he built his life around was wrong, and is standing in the wreckage of it with his hands at his sides and his eyes on her face, and is, despite everything, still here. "They're coming," he said. "Yes," she said. A long moment. Outside, somewhere beyond the fog and the garden and the stone path, the first sound of the perimeter team repositioning reached the window. A vehicle door. A brief radio transmission. The organized movement of people who had trained for exactly this and were now doing it. "Tell me what you need," Dante said. Valentina looked at him. Not the look from the night before, not the documenting look, the operational assessment. Something different. Something that went back further than 14 months, further than the counter-operation, back to the part of the 10 years that had been real and the part of her that had made choices about what to know and what not to know and why. She held the look for exactly as long as she could afford to hold it. Then she said, "Stay in this room," and walked out to meet whatever was coming up the road. She walked fast. Not running. Running was for people who had lost control of the situation, and Valentina Romano had not lost control of the situation. She had a situation that had changed faster than anticipated, and that was not the same thing. She moved down the corridor with the contained velocity of a person whose body understood that the next 30 minutes were going to require everything it had and was already converting itself accordingly. Torres was at the end of the corridor with his radio in one hand and his phone in the other, talking in the low, rapid cadence of a man coordinating multiple moving parts simultaneously. He saw her coming and held up 2 fingers without breaking the radio call. 2 vehicles. That was what the 2 fingers meant, 2 vehicles on the approach road. She reached him. He ended the radio call. "Main gate?" she said. "Closed. Manual locks engaged. Hernandez has 4 people at the gate structure, 2 more at the secondary access." He looked at his phone. "External perimeter team is repositioning. The cliff access is covered." "The approach road has a curve at the 400-meter mark," Valentina said. "If they stop before the curve, they're outside the camera coverage." "I know. I have Reyes pulling the road cameras from the county network." He paused. "That'll take 3 minutes." "We have 2, she said. She kept moving. Down the main staircase, across the great room. The wall display was still on. The ownership document still there in high definition, absurd in the context of what was happening, and she crossed past them without looking, through the east corridor and into the security operations room, which was a space that had been built into the original renovation as a climate-controlled server room and had been gradually repurposed over 8 years into something more honest about its actual function. Reyes was at the primary workstation. 3 screens in front of her, each running a different feed. Her hands on the keyboard moved with the particular efficiency of someone who has trained muscle memory to operate faster than conscious instruction. "Road cameras," Valentina said. 90 seconds. Reyes didn't look up. 2 vehicles confirmed on the approach, full-size SUVs, dark, no plates readable on the gate camera. A pause. They slowed at the 400-meter mark. They know the coverage gap. "How many in each vehicle?" "Can't confirm from the gate camera angle. Minimum 4 per vehicle based on vehicle weight under the bridge sensor." She looked up briefly. "That's a minimum of 8. Valentina ran the arithmetic. 8 coming in. Her internal security team was 12, including Torres. The external perimeter team was 4, currently repositioning. The senior captains from the night before were still in the house. Ferris and 2 others. neither of whom were active security personnel, but both of whom had, over their years in the organization, been in rooms where things happened and had emerged from those rooms. Caruso was somewhere in the house. Kessler was irrelevant to this specific problem. "They're going to try the secondary access," she said. "The cliff path." Reyes was already pulling up the cliff access camera. The path was empty. The two security personnel who were supposed to be at the base of the path were not visible on camera. "Where are Morales and Kwan?" Valentina said. Reyes typed, checked a position log. "Last manual check-in was 11 minutes ago. That's outside protocol." 11 minutes. 11 minutes ago was before Brecht's contact with Volkov had been confirmed, before Torres had started moving the perimeter. The timing was not a coincidence. "Volkov had people in position before they told Brecht to send the signal," Valentina said. She said it not as a revelation but as a recalibration, adjusting the picture, updating the operational map. They were already staged. "They've been planning the approach independently of Dante's timeline," Reyes said. "Dante was never the primary operation," Valentina said. "He was the distraction." She let this land for exactly the time it took to land and moved past it. The implication could be analyzed later. Right now the cliff path was uncovered, and there were at minimum 8 trained people on the approach road who had been staging for this with more preparation than she'd allocated to defending against it. She picked up the radio from the secondary station. "Torres, here. Cliff path is uncovered. Morales and Kwan are off-grid." A brief pause on his end, the pause of a man updating his picture. "Redirect 2 from the gate to the cliff base. Now." That leaves Hernandez with 2 at the gate. "I know. Valentina, I know, Torres." She set down the radio. She looked at Reyes. "The secondary protocol I activated. How long for full response?" "External response team is 12 minutes out minimum," Reyes said. They were positioned for the planned timeline. The acceleration, 12 minutes, Valentina said. 11 now. 11 minutes. 8 people minimum already staged, with cliff path access uncovered and gate security reduced. 11 minutes until the external response team arrived. The mathematics of the situation were not comfortable, but they were clear, which was something she could work with. "Lock down the north and east wings," she said. "I want Ferris and the other 2 captains armed and positioned at the main corridor intersection. Caruso goes to the secure room. He doesn't leave it under any circumstances. That's non-negotiable." She looked at the screens. "And Celeste Vaughn?" "North wing guest room," Reyes said. "Keep her there. Lock it from outside if you have to." She paused. "She doesn't come out until this is resolved." Reyes nodded, already typing. Valentina turned toward the door. "Where are you going?" Reyes said. "The great room," Valentina said. "It has the best sight lines in the house." She walked out. Eat. The great room felt different in the early morning, with the chandeliers at half power and the wall display still running. Larger, somehow, the ceiling higher, and less inhabited. The paintings on the walls watched from their frames with the complete indifference of art to the conditions of the rooms it occupies. Ferris was already there when Valentina arrived. She must have heard the radio traffic, or Torres had reached her, or she had simply developed, over 20 years in organized crime, the ability to sense the change in atmospheric pressure that precedes violence. She was standing near the east doorway with a compact automatic pistol at her side, her silver hair brushed back, her face with the expression of a woman who has been in this kind of room before and has learned that what keeps you alive is not speed, but precision. "How many?" Ferris said. "Minimum 8. Probably more." Valentina stopped in the center of the room and turned in a slow circle, looking at the entry points: main staircase, east corridor, west corridor, the terrace doors, the interior access from the service wing. "They'll come from 2 directions. The approach road team will hit the gate. The cliff path team, however many that is, comes up through the garden." "Terrace doors," Ferris said, looking at them. "Yes." The terrace doors were glass, reinforced, but glass. Visibility went both ways. "I want those covered." "Santiago," Ferris said to one of the 2 men with her without looking at him. He moved to the terrace doors and took a position at the side wall where he had an angle on the doors without being visible through them. The other man, younger, solidly built, someone whose name Valentina knew but was not retrieving in this moment, moved to the main staircase without being told and positioned himself at the base of it with the instinctive spatial logic of a person who had been trained in room defense. Ferris looked at Valentina. "You should be in the secure room." "No." Valentina. "No." She said it quietly, but it was not a word she was going to revisit. "This is my house. This is my organization." She looked at the terrace doors, at the fog still sitting on the garden beyond them. "I don't leave this room." Ferris looked at her for a moment. Then she turned away, which was her version of acceptance. She moved to the east doorway and took a position there that covered the corridor approach. The radio on Valentina's hip crackled. "Torres. Gate contact. Vehicle 1 is at the gate. They're not stopping." The sound that followed was distinct and recognizable. Metal under impact. The gate structure taking the weight of an SUV that had decided the gate was not going to be an obstacle. Then the radio went to static for 2 seconds. Then Torres. "Gate is breached. Hernandez has contact." From somewhere outside and below, the flat percussion of gunfire started. Short controlled bursts, the sound of trained people working, not the chaotic volume of panic. Valentina heard it and cataloged it and kept her attention on the room. "Cliff Path," she said into the radio. "Report." Nothing. She tried again. "Cliff Path team, report." A voice that was not one of her people. Male, accented, briefly audible before the transmission cut. "Cliff Path is compromised," she said to the room. Not loudly, stating the operational fact for the people in it who needed it. Ferris's hands tightened on her pistol. The terrace doors were still closed. The fog was still on the garden. Somewhere beyond the garden and the fog and the stone path, people were moving up the cliff stairs in the gray morning with the practiced silence of men who had done this before in other houses. The door from the service wing opened. Dante came through it. He was moving fast, and he had something in his right hand, and Valentina's body processed threat before her mind confirmed identity. The instinct running ahead of cognition, and she was already stepping left, and the young man at the base of the stairs had already raised his weapon when the something in Dante's right hand registered as a radio, not a firearm, and the room recalibrated in the fraction of a second it takes for identifications to cascade through a group of armed people. Nobody fired. Dante stopped. He looked at the weapons pointed at him and did not move. "It's me," he said. Unnecessary, but he said it anyway. "The service wing is not secure," Valentina said. "How did you—" "The door from the east guest wing to the service corridor doesn't have a magnetic lock," he said. "It has a standard deadbolt. I had a credit card." He met her eyes. "I've been in this house for 10 years. She looked at him. The radio in his hand, her radio, the one she had left on the work table in the study in the 4 seconds of the last 3 minutes that she had been in the study. He had come back for it. Or he had come back for something and the radio was incidental. "You should have stayed," she said. "I heard the gate breach," he said. "You have people on the cliff path that aren't yours." "I know." "The service wing has a ground-level access through the kitchen utility door," he said. "It doesn't appear on the architectural drawings. It was added in the 2019 renovation as a secondary delivery access." He looked at her. "Does Torres know about it?" She looked at him. The 2019 renovation. Torres had not been with the organization in 2019. Reyes had overseen the renovation security, but the utility access had been filed under the contractor's documentation, not the security assessment. It was a gap, small, specific, the kind of gap that exists in every large structure because large structures are built by many people and not all of them talk to each other. She brought the radio up. "Torres, kitchen utility door, ground-level service wing, needs coverage, now." Torres's response was immediate. "On it." "How do you know about the utility door?" Valentina said to Dante. "I had a conversation with the contractor," Dante said. 3 years ago. He mentioned it in the context of a different renovation project I was considering for the East Wing." He paused. "I make a point of knowing about access points." "You never told me." "No," he said. "I didn't." There was a specific layer to this exchange that neither of them addressed, because the room and the moment and the sounds coming from outside made addressing it impossible. But it was there. The admission inside the admission, the specific shape of a man who had spent years cataloging information about a place he was planning to take, admitting it plainly to the woman he had been planning to take it from, in the context of using that same information to help her defend it. "Stay in my sight line," Valentina said. He moved to a position near the east wall, below the large dark blue painting. He held the radio at his side. From outside, the gunfire near the gate intensified briefly and then reduced. Not ending, reducing, the pattern of an engagement settling into its sustained phase. Torres was managing it. The radio traffic was clipped and professional, the language of people doing their work. The terrace doors, movement in the fog. Santiago, positioned at the side wall, saw it before anyone else. The peripheral awareness of a trained person in a darkened position watching a lit space. He said nothing. He simply adjusted the angle of his weapon by approximately 15 degrees, the micro-adjustment of a man acquiring a target. Valentina saw the adjustment. She looked at the terrace doors, a shape in the fog. Then two, then three, moving through the garden with the deliberate patience of people who believed they had not been seen. "Wait," Valentina said, quietly. Santiago held. The shapes moved toward the terrace doors. They were organized, one central, two flanking, the geometric spacing of a practiced entry team. They moved without sound, or without sound that reached through the glass and the fog. The central figure reached the terrace door and tried the handle. The door was locked. A brief pause. Then the central figure produced something, a tool, a device, and applied it to the door's external lock mechanism. "Wait," Valentina said again. The lock disengaged. The terrace door opened. The central figure stepped through. "Now," Valentina said. Santiago fired once. The central figure went down in the doorway, partially blocking the entrance. The two flanking figures outside the door scattered, one left, one right, back into the fog, the disciplined dispersion of a unit that had trained for the possibility of losing the point man. Ferris was already moving from the east doorway, cutting the angle on the left flank. The young man at the stairs moved to cover the right side of the terrace opening. The central figure in the doorway was not dead. He was down, and he was hit somewhere in the upper body, and he was trying to move back toward the door frame with the grim industrial persistence of a person whose body has not yet received the instruction to stop. His weapon, a compact submachine gun, was on the terrace floor to his left, out of reach. Valentina crossed the room in 8 steps and crouched beside him. He was looking up at her. He was perhaps 35, short, dark hair, a face she had never seen. His breathing was the ragged, wet breathing of a chest wound, each breath costing more than the last. There was blood on the terrace flagstones beneath him, dark and spreading. "Volkov sent you," she said. He looked at her. He said nothing. "How many on the cliff path?" she said. His eyes moved slightly. Not refusal, calculation, a man measuring what he had left and what it was worth. "4," he said. The word cost him something physical. 2 are down. He paused. 2 made the top. 2 on the cliff path had reached the top, which meant they were in the garden. The 2 flanking figures who had scattered into the fog, at least one of them was from the cliff path team, not this entry team. She looked at the fog. She stood. "Ferris," she said. "I heard," Ferris said from the east doorway. The radio crackled. Torres. "Gate team is contained. Hernandez has 2 down, one of ours is hit, not critical. The second vehicle stopped at the gate, they did not breach." A pause. "They're holding outside the gate, waiting." Waiting. The second vehicle was waiting. That was the reserve. The people Volkov had held back to move on whatever came out of the first engagement. Standard doctrine for a complex assault. Commit the initial team, hold the reserve for the exploitation phase. "How long on the external response team?" Valentina said into the radio. Torres. 7 minutes. 7 minutes with 2 unaccounted figures in the fog, a reserve vehicle at the gate, 1 man down in the terrace doorway, and the first gray light of a real sunrise beginning to push against the marine layer above the Pacific. The terrace doors were open. The fog came in slightly, cold, carrying the smell of the ocean and the garden and the morning. Valentina stood in the great room and looked at the open doors and felt the cold air on her face and felt her own heartbeat, which had been running high since the moment Reyes came through the study door with the phone, settle into the particular steady rhythm of someone who has moved past the fear of the situation into the functional state that exists on the other side of fear when fear has been processed and set aside. She was aware of Dante behind her. She did not look at him. "Reyes," she said into the radio. "Thermal on the garden." A pause. "Working." Another pause, 15 seconds that felt longer. Two figures east side of the garden moving toward the service wing. A pause. "They're going for the utility door." The kitchen utility door, the door Dante had told her about, the door Torres was moving to cover. "Torres," she said, "they're at the utility door." Torres. "I have one man there." Garcia. A pause. "Garcia?" The radio did not answer. "Garcia is down," Torres said. Valentina turned. Dante was already moving toward the service wing doorway. He had the radio up and he was moving fast, not running but close to it, the particular controlled urgency of a man who has made a decision and is executing it before the part of his brain that generates objections can produce them. "Dante," Ferris said. "The service corridor connects to the kitchen utility from the inside," Dante said without stopping. "If they come through the utility door, they have a direct path to the main house. There's no coverage until the corridor intersection." He reached the service wing doorway. He looked back at Valentina. "There's a fire suppression panel in the service corridor. If I trip it manually, it locks all the internal fire doors, slows them down." Valentina looked at him. He was standing in the doorway with the radio in his hand and his jacket from last night, and the 10 years of this house written on his face and the specific expression of a man who has no cards left and knows it and has stopped thinking about cards entirely. "The panel is on the right wall, 2/3 down the corridor," she said. "Red housing. You have to break the glass." He turned and went through the door. Ferris looked at Valentina. Something passed between them. Not quite disbelief, not quite its opposite, something that did not have a name. "Cover the service wing entrance," Valentina said. Ferris moved. The young man at the base of the stairs was watching the terrace opening, the fog outside it, the fog still carrying the cold and the smell of the sea. Nothing moved in it. The two figures had gone around to the utility door, which meant the terrace was, for the moment, an open doorway into the house with nothing in front of it but morning fog and the question of whether there was anyone else in the garden that the thermal had not found. Valentina walked to the terrace doorway. She stood in it, not outside, in the threshold, and looked into the garden. The fog was thick enough to reduce visibility to perhaps 20 feet, beyond 20 feet, gray and formless. The path between the hedges was empty as far as she could see. She listened. The Pacific, below the cliff, constant and indifferent. Wind in the garden hedges. Somewhere to the east, the distant sound of the gate engagement winding down. The sound of Torres' radio traffic, very faint, from the security room down the corridor. From somewhere in the service wing, a sharp crack, the sound of breaking glass, followed immediately by a mechanical sequence. The fire doors engaging one by one down the corridor, each one a compressed pneumatic impact, the building's suppression system doing what it had been installed to do. Then, from inside the service wing, voices. Not Dante's voice, other voices, sharp and brief, the sounds of people in an enclosed space who have just encountered an obstacle. Then a different sound, a single gunshot. Then silence. Then another. Then Dante's voice on the radio, breathing hard, his voice at the particular pitch of someone who has just run 30 feet and done something with their body that cost them. "Fire doors are locked. They're in the corridor." A pause. "I have one of them. The other one is—" The radio cut. Static. Valentina came back into the great room. "Ferris!" Ferris was already at the service wing doorway. "I heard." "Go." Ferris went through the door without ceremony. Valentina stood in the great room. The open terrace door behind her, the fog and the cold. The wall display still running, the ownership documents still there, still correct, still entirely beside the point. She picked up the radio. Torres. Here. Service wing. I need someone in the service corridor. I have one man free. Sending him. The second vehicle at the gate. Still holding. When the external response team arrives, they come through the east approach. Not the main gate. Tell them the main gate approach has a vehicle with unknown number of armed personnel. Understood. She set the radio down. She stood in the center of the great room under the half-powered chandeliers with the cold ocean air coming through the open terrace doors and waited. This was the specific skill that most people who operated at her level never learned, because it ran counter to every instinct of a person who had built something from nothing and defended it through intelligence and force of will and the refusal to be still when things were moving. The skill of knowing when everything that could be done had been done, and the situation now had to resolve itself, and the only thing left was to be present for the resolution. She waited. From the service wing, a muffled impact. A voice, Ferris, indistinct, then quiet. From outside, the second vehicle at the gate, still holding. The external response team, somewhere on the coast highway, 7 minutes reduced to perhaps 4 now, moving toward a situation that was going to be resolved before they arrived, or would require them to finish resolving. From the terrace doorway, nothing. Fog, cold. The sound of the ocean below the cliff, steady and permanent. The one element of the scene that did not care what happened in the house above it. Then footsteps in the service wing doorway. She turned. Ferris came through the doorway. She had blood on her sleeve set, not hers. The angle of it was wrong for that. And she was moving with the slightly careful gait of a person operating on adrenaline and monitoring their own body for damage it hasn't reported yet. Behind her was Torres's man. Behind him was Dante. He was alive. He was walking without support, which was the relevant information, but he was walking with his left hand pressed against his right side, and the hand was dark, and the side of his shirt beneath it was dark, and it was the kind of dark that was specific and not ambiguous. He came into the room and stopped. He looked at Valentina. She crossed the room. She didn't say anything yet. She moved his hand away from his side and looked at the wound. High on the right flank, below the ribs, not the location that ended things immediately, but not the location that permitted complacency either. She pressed his hand back against it. She looked at his face. His face was very pale. The amber eyes were fully alert. The shock had not reached them yet. His brain was still running on the last of the adrenaline. But behind the alertness was the particular quality of a person who has been hit and knows it and is managing a very specific set of reactions. Sit, she said. He sat. On the floor, which was the right choice for someone in his condition, the low center of gravity choice. He put his back against the east wall, below the dark blue painting, and kept his hand pressed to his side. One is down in the corridor, Ferris said. The other made it back to the utility door. She paused. Utility door is locked from the inside now. They're outside. Torres? Valentina said into the radio. Exterior east wall. Utility door. Torres. I see them. I have angle. A pause. They're moving toward the gate. The reserve vehicle at the gate. Still holding. A pause. They're trying to reach it. Another pause. Shorter. Reached it. Vehicle is moving. Direction. North. Down the approach road. A pause that was longer than the others. They're running. The room absorbed this. Running. The reserve vehicle was taking the survivors and running, which meant that the calculus of the assault had changed. The reserve would only break if the expected outcome of holding had degraded below the threshold of viability, which meant someone in that vehicle had done the arithmetic and concluded that whatever objective they had come to achieve was no longer achievable. Reyes, Valentina said into the radio. Volkov's people are withdrawing. Track the vehicle. Reyes's voice steady. Already on it. I have county traffic cameras on the north approach. A pause. And the external response team is 2 minutes out. 2 minutes. Valentina looked at the room. The young man at the stairs. Santiago near the terrace, which he had moved away from to cover the interior. Ferris by the service wing door. Torres's man standing in the middle of the room with the look of a person who has come down off a very high operational state and is waiting to be told what to do next. The open terrace doors. The fog, beginning to move now as the marine layer started to break up. The first actual daylight beginning to differentiate the gray of the sky from the gray of the sea. And Dante on the floor beneath the painting, pale and alert and pressing his hand to his side, watching her with the amber eyes that had always been the thing she could not entirely read. She went to the coffee service table. It was still there, the coffee from this morning, cold now, and found a folded cloth napkin. She brought it back and crouched beside him and moved his hand and put the napkin against the wound and pressed his hand back over it. "Harder," she said. He pressed harder. His jaw tightened at the pressure. He did not make a sound. "You tripped the fire panel," she said. "Yes. The first shot. I had the radio," he said. "It's heavier than it looks." She looked at him. Despite everything, the blood and the fog and the open terrace door and the 7 things that were still unresolved outside this room, something moved in her face that was not operational. It was smaller and more specific. The involuntary response of a person confronted with an absurdity that is also real. "You hit someone with a radio," she said. "I hit him with the fire panel housing first," Dante said. "The radio was secondary." He paused. His breathing was controlled, but it was costing him. "The second man had a gun. I was faster." "You're not faster," she said. "You got lucky." "I know." She looked at his side. The napkin was already saturated. The wound was not going to wait for comfort. "When the response team arrives," she said, "one of them is a medic." "I'll be here," he said. From outside the estate's main structure, coming up the eastern approach road with a discipline and speed that was recognizable even at distance as the organized movement of people who had done this professionally, the external response team arrived. From the terrace doorway, the fog was breaking. The Pacific below the cliff was coming into clarity. The water gray-green in the early light, the white of the breaking waves at the base of the cliff consistent and indifferent, the surface of something so large it had no opinion about the events above it. Valentina stood in the great room of her house, which was still her house, with the wall display behind her showing the documents that confirmed this in language that did not require interpretation, and looked at the fog lifting off the garden and felt the cold air on her face and felt her own heartbeat, which had been running at this particular sustained, elevated rate for approximately 4 hours, begin, very slowly, one measured beat at a time, to come down. It was not over. The second vehicle was on the north approach road. Pell was somewhere in the city or outside it. Brecht had not been located. The federal package had transmitted, but its effects were weeks away. The 14 families needed to be contacted. The internal breach, whoever had given Brecht the counter-operation timeline, was still unidentified. There was a great deal left, but the house was still standing. Her people were alive, most of them. The organization's core structure was intact. The attack had failed, and the failure was complete. And the vehicles going north on the approach road were carrying people who had made the calculation that the cost of continuing was higher than the cost of withdrawing. She had made them make that calculation. She turned from the terrace doorway and looked at Dante on the floor beneath the dark blue painting, pressing a blood-soaked napkin to his side with both hands now, watching her with eyes that were still alert and still, underneath the alertness, entirely unreadable to her in the specific way they had always been unreadable when he was being something real rather than something performed. She held his gaze. The response team came through the east corridor in organized single file, and behind them, moving with the professional urgency of a person who has been briefed in the vehicle and is already cataloging the room for what it contains and what it needs, the medic came through the door, and Valentina said his name and pointed, and the medic moved across the room toward the man on the floor beneath the painting, and outside the fog was lifting, and the Pacific caught the first real light of the morning and went from gray to something that was almost, not quite, blue. 3 months later, Marcus Pell was found in a rented room above a laundromat in a mid-sized city 400 miles north of the estate, living under a name that had not held up to the kind of scrutiny Reyes applied to it. He had not been difficult to find, in the end. He had been careful, but not careful enough, which was the story of most people who ran from the Romano organization. They understood they needed to disappear, but they did not understand that disappearing was a full-time occupation requiring a complete severance from every prior habit. And most people could not sustain that severance because most people were, at bottom, creatures of pattern. Pell's pattern was coffee. Specifically, a particular brand of ground coffee he ordered through a subscription service under the false name. The subscription created a shipping address. The shipping address was a P.O. box at a mail center. The mail center had security cameras. The cameras showed a face. Reyes had the face matched in 11 days. The federal authorities, who had received Reyes' package 3 months prior through the encrypted anonymous relay, were by then already inside the Volkov syndicate's financial structure with the specific industriousness of people who had been waiting for a case this clean for a long time. The documentation Valentina had provided was precise, sourced, and actionable in ways that the Federal Task Force's own independent intelligence had not been. Within 6 weeks of transmission, 3 of Volkov's cash businesses had been seized, the freight handler contacts had been arrested, and the Port Authority connection had been suspended pending investigation. Within 10 weeks, Igor Volkov himself had retained 3 separate defense attorneys and stopped appearing in public. The Volkov syndicate did not collapse dramatically. It contracted, the way organizations contract when leadership becomes legally encumbered and operational assets are progressively frozen. The outer layers falling away first, the mid-level people making quiet arrangements to be elsewhere. The whole structure slowly losing coherence the way a building loses structural integrity, when the load-bearing elements are removed one by one. By the end of the 3rd month, it was a legal problem rather than an operational one, which was the most effective form of destruction available. Sully Brecht was found in the 2nd month. He had not run, which said something about his specific kind of intelligence, which had always been the intelligence of a man who calculated odds and trusted the calculation. He had calculated that Valentina's primary focus would be the Volkov threat, and that in the disruption of the assault and its aftermath, he might find room to negotiate. He had miscalculated the speed of Reyes's assessment. When 2 of Ferris's people arrived at his apartment on a Tuesday morning, Brecht was in his kitchen eating breakfast, and he looked at them with the expression of a man who has run the numbers one final time and found them irreversible. He did not negotiate. There was nothing left to negotiate with. The internal breach, the person who had given Brecht the counter-operation timeline, was identified in the 3rd week. It was not a senior person. It was a communications technician named Roark, who had been with the organization for 4 years and had been in a relationship, unknown to anyone in the organization, with a woman who was Brecht's cousin. The relationship had created a channel. The channel had been used, perhaps without full understanding of the implications, to pass operational details that Brecht then passed to Volkov. Roark was 26 years old and had understood, when Reyes's people came for him, that his 4 years of careful, unremarkable service had been erased by one relationship he had never thought to mention. Reyes told Valentina about Roark on a Wednesday afternoon in the security operations room. Valentina listened to the complete account without interrupting. Then she said, "Age 26, and Reyes said, "Yes." And Valentina sat with this for a moment and then said, "Handle it." And Reyes said, "Yes." And that was the complete conversation. The 14 families received the broadcast documentation, the ownership records, the Volkov materials, the recordings, in a coordinated transmission on a Thursday morning, 6 days after the assault. The response was, across the board, the response of people who had always suspected the Romano organization's internal discipline was of a specific quality, and were now having the quality confirmed. 3 families sent formal communications of continued cooperation within 24 hours. The remaining 11 sent communications within the week. Not one family expressed interest in revisiting the terms of their existing arrangements. Dante's name appeared in none of these communications. His name appeared in no documentation that left the estate. Internally, in Reyes's operational logs and Kessler's legal files, he existed as a subject and a variable. In the world outside the estate, he existed as Valentina Romano's husband, which was a category that had not changed on any public record. He spent 11 days in the estate's east wing recovering from the wound. The medic, a compact, efficient woman named Dress, who had been with the response team for 6 years, had assessed the wound within 2 minutes of reaching him and had begun the work of keeping him stable with the brisk competence of someone who had managed worse in less controlled conditions. The wound had been serious. It had not been the kind of serious that ended things, but it had been the kind that required specific attention and specific rest and a sustained discipline about both. And Dante, who was many things, was not a person who found sustained rest easy. He lay in the East Wing room, a different room than the one he'd been locked in the night of the confrontation, larger, with a window that opened, and did something he had not done in a very long time, which was nothing. He was not planning. He was not calculating. He was not assessing angles or managing information or building the architecture of a thing he intended to take. He was lying in a bed with a wound in his side and the particular flatness of a man who has run completely empty and is waiting for whatever comes next to announce itself. Valentina came on the fourth day. She came in the evening when the light through the open window was going orange and low, and she sat in the chair beside the bed rather than the chair across the room that would have been the chair of someone maintaining distance. She sat close. She had a file in her hand. She almost always had a file in her hand. It was as fundamental to her appearance as the way she held her shoulders, but she set the file on the floor without opening it. She looked at him. He looked at her. Outside the window, the light moved on the water far below. "Brecht is handled," she said. "I heard. Pell will be handled by the end of the week." She paused. "The Volkov situation is federal now. It runs its own course." "I know." She looked at her hands briefly, then back at him. "Rourke," she said. "The internal breach. 26 years old." He said nothing. "He didn't understand what he was doing," she said. "Not fully." "People rarely do," Dante said. She looked at him. The look was not accusatory. It was the look of a woman hearing a true thing said by someone with a specific standing to say it. "No," she said, "they rarely do." The silence between them had a different quality than the silences of the confrontation nights and the study morning and the great room with its wall display. Those silences had been structural, silences built from opposition, from the gap between what each of them knew and what each of them was prepared to acknowledge. This silence was different. It was the silence of two people who have gotten to the bottom of something and are sitting at the bottom of it together, without the energy or the purpose to perform anything other than what they actually are. "What happens now?" Dante said. He meant specifically and also generally, the word now carrying both layers, and they both understood this. "The organization continues," Valentina said. "It's stronger than it was. The Volkov exposure cleaned out things that needed cleaning." She looked at the window. "Caruso is restructuring the Northeast presence. Ferris takes a more operational role. Reyes keeps the intelligence function." She paused. "The businesses expand. The structure holds." "And me," he said. She turned back from the window. She looked at him for a long time. Long enough that the orange light moved and became something cooler, and the water below the cliff went from warm to dark, and the first stars appeared at the edge of the sky above the window frame. "You told me about the utility door," she said. "Yes." "You tripped the fire panel." "Yes." "You could have stayed in the study," she said. "You had the radio. You knew the response team was coming." She held his gaze. "You chose not to." He did not argue with this. There was no argument to make. He had made a choice in the service corridor with the fire panel glass broken under his hand, and the sound of the utility door opening behind him and a stranger's footsteps in the dark. And the choice had been the choice of a man who had run out of other things to be and had defaulted, in the absence of options, to something that was underneath everything else he'd built on top of himself. "I know what I was planning," he said. "I know what I was going to take from you." "Yes." "I can't undo it." "No." "The apology exists," he said, "whether you want it or not. It exists." She looked at him. Something moved in her face, the controlled surface of it, the finished document quality of it, and for a moment he saw what was underneath. Not softness, not its opposite. Something older and more worn and more honest than either. The face of a woman who had loved a man badly and been betrayed by him thoroughly and was now sitting in a room with him after he had taken a bullet in the side of her house and had not run when running was an option, and was trying to figure out what to do with the full complicated weight of all of it. "I know it exists," she said. She picked up the file from the floor. She set it on the bed beside him. "You're not on the asset documents," she said. "You'll never be on the asset documents. That doesn't change." "I know. Your role in the organization, the public-facing function, the relationships, that work was real. Whatever else was happening, that work was real." She looked at the file. "What you do with that going forward is a conversation for when you're able to have it standing up." He looked at the file. "What's in it?" "The Rotterdam logistics contact," she said. "The one you gave to Volkov. Reyes cleared him 2 weeks ago. He's operational again." She paused. "There's a situation developing in the European structure that needs someone who can read a room and negotiate without appearing to negotiate." She held his gaze. "Someone who is comfortable in rooms I find tedious." The old phrase, his phrase, or the phrase that had always described what he was to the organization in its most honest form, repurposed and returned to him across the distance of everything that had happened. He understood what she was not saying. She was not forgiving him. She was not rebuilding what had been broken, because what had been broken could not be rebuilt. It could only be replaced by something different, something that knew what it was made of, something without the illusion of equality that had lived in the space between them for 10 years and had finally cost them both more than it was worth. She was offering him instead a true thing, a real function in a real structure, without the lie of partnership and without the lie of ownership. The work. Just the work. He put his hand on the file. "All right," he said. She stood. She straightened her jacket with the small decisive motion that meant she had concluded a thing and was moving to the next. She picked up the file, she would leave it later when he was ready for it, and moved to the door. At the door she stopped. "Celeste Vaughn," she said, she's been cooperating with Reyes. The account of the meetings, the intermediaries, the conversations, it's been complete and accurate." "She's like that," Dante said. "She'll be all right," Valentina said. It was a statement of intention rather than prediction, the particular kind of assertion a person makes when they are deciding something rather than observing it. She walked out. Well, 2 months after that, on a morning in early autumn when the fog had not yet come, and the Pacific was flat and silver and the cliffside estate stood clear in the light the way it rarely stood clear, Valentina was on the west balcony with coffee she was not drinking. The Romano organization was the Romano organization. The Volkov syndicate was in federal court and contracting toward nothing. The 14 families were in their arrangements, the businesses, the casinos, the shipping, the real estate, the offshore structures, were running with the disciplined efficiency of things that had been built by a person who understood their architecture from the inside out. She stood at the balcony railing with her coffee going cold in her hand and looked at the water. Dante was in Rotterdam. He had left 6 days ago. The European situation was proceeding. Reyes had a communication channel on the operation, and the first reports were what she expected them to be. Competent, careful, the work of a man who was not performing capability, but actually employing it. Celeste Vaughn was in a different city, in a different life, with the organizational understanding that the Romano organization was aware of her and had no quarrel with her, and required nothing of her except the basic courtesy of her continued silence, which she had indicated she intended to maintain. She was practical. She would maintain it. Valentina looked at the water. She thought about what Dante had said in the East Wing room in the orange light. The apology exists, whether you want it or not. She had not told him what she did with it. She was not certain she knew yet. Some things required more time than the immediate situation allowed, and she had learned over 20 years of building and managing and defending something in a world that did not make it easy, that the capacity to wait, for information to complete itself, for understanding to arrive at its own pace, for the right moment rather than the available one, was the actual foundation of everything she had built. Not the intelligence, not the structure, not the documents Kessler kept in his accordion files. The capacity to wait. She drank the cold coffee. She set the cup on the railing. The Pacific went on and on toward the flat horizon where the water met the sky, and both of them kept going, indifferent and permanent. The same this morning as they had been every morning and would be every morning after this one, long after the estate and the organization and the people in it had become other things or stopped being anything at all. She turned from the railing and went back inside. There was work. There was always work. She did it.